visionary founder and president of Global Opportunities, Inc., a US based company dedicated to fostering trade and economic connections between the United States and developing countries, with a primary focus on the Middle East and African regions. With a commitment rooted in the belief that enhanced interaction between US companies and developing economies can open new markets for American products and also at the same time provide significant opportunities for citizens in these regions. With over 30 years of experience in political and governmental affairs, he remains a sought after expert for his political and governmental prowess. Today, we're going to discuss how the U.S. can benefit from strengthening ties with places like Africa. From North Brunswick, New Jersey, I'd like to welcome founder and president of Global Opportunities, Gary Hirsch. Welcome, Gary, and thank you so much for being here today. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Chrissy. Me too. It's a pleasure, and I appreciate your invitation.
So, I had the pleasure of hearing your presentation at the American Society of Agriculture Consultants Convention a few months back in Fresno, California. It was a fantastic speech, and it really made me think outside of North America. I'm usually focused on North American agriculture. So that's kind of where, I end up in a box there. And your presentation really made me get out of that box and start thinking imports, exports, and more on a global level. So, but before we get into details, let's start out with your background. How did you get to where you are today?
Well, as I said, and you said before, I have a political background, actually. I've been involved in actually 40 years. I'm dating myself a little bit. But I really developed an interest in Africa back in college. Took a number of courses, African history, African politics, like other parts of the world. And as I developed this idea for global opportunities a number of years back, it was really focused. I used some of my political experience and my history background to say, hey, there really aren't a lot of ties between the United States and Africa. I'm a big follower of the news, and you see that Africa is just a growing, one of the most important growing places in the world today, both in terms of population and in terms of significance in the political sphere. And it's really imperative that the United States get more involved with the countries. I'm talking economically. I mean, we've had our military involvement with many countries, and we've obviously got diplomatic relations, but economically, I always say Egypt, Morocco, South Africa, to a certain extent, there's been a little bit more of an advance because of, again, goes back to some of the political and military relations. But if you look at most of the countries in Africa, sure, you've got your big companies, you've got Coca-Cola, and you've got Hertz Rent-A-Car, and some of our big multinationals, and you've had some other involvement, but there's really, really a lacking of U.S. economic involvement. And as I say, listen, I'm a big waiver of the American flag. I believe in the United States. I live, breathe, eat pro-America. But we can go around, as I say many times, we can go around and we can preach democracy as much as we want. But if you can't feed your children, you don't necessarily care who your president is.
Right.
And we have to help people in countries like this build their own economies up, not necessarily at the expense of the United States. There's ways, and that's what we're working on. There's ways to find how we can create jobs here at home by creating jobs overseas in countries like over in Africa. And I think together, the United States and Africa can grow. And we're going to find our own political status in the world strengthened by helping people help themselves.
Yeah, great points there. And so tell me, considering the current global tension all across the globe, tell me about the need for the US on a tangible level to get more involved economically in Africa specifically.
Well, again, there are parts of the world where I say we have our love-hate relationship sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Sub-Saharan Africa, there really is a reservoir of goodwill for the United States.
Hmm.
And they don't quite understand why we don't understand them, why we're not there more. Um, our competitors and our adversaries are there. And listen, sometimes you can chalk it up to Americans just not having much knowledge of these countries. You really don't read much about it in the news. Um, People are like, where are some of these countries? There are, issues again with distance. There are issues with, when it comes to exports, certainly price. I mean, some of our things are just too pricey for economies that, and for populations that, really aren't above the lower middle income status. So there's a lot of challenges, but there are really ways to see how we can make these pieces fit together. And the folks there really welcome our expertise, our knowledge, our the relations that they see. Because, listen, a lot of these, pretty much every country, there's a diaspora here. I mean, if you look, there's a Zambia, I believe there's a Zambia American, I don't remember the exact words, civic association here in the United States. There are ties, and that's one of the great things. I know there's a big debate about immigration now, but one of the strengths of the United States also is we have these folks that are, whatever, Zambian American, Angolan American, Mozambican American. I mean, it may not be as much as Irish or German American, but there are ties, and that goodwill, it really goes across the ocean, and we're just not taking advantage of it. And the folks there want us to.
Yeah, those are great points. And you talked about in your speech the 100-pound gorilla in your presentation at the ASAC convention. Can you explain this story and specifically what is the 100-pound gorilla?
Sure. Well, it's actually an 800-pound gorilla because it's
800. Yes,
it's
that's right.
that big. Sure. This is a real good example, although there's been a few.
Mhm.
There's a project I'm working on, which we're looking to help some of the folks over there increase their production of, rice, corn, soy, some of the, the basic grains, and some of the other foodstuffs. Again, as I said when we were in California at the conference, I'm a suburban guy. I mean, I try to say, okay, well, when somebody comes to me and says, "Can you bring us experts here? Can you, find machine?" I try to think, okay, well, where do you start? So for this, I said, okay, well, in rice and corn and soy, a lot, for example, is down south. So I started calling different people, different associations, and I spoke with one lady, very nice lady, one of the associations down south, and I told the story. Here's what we're looking for. We're looking for experts, yada yada yada, and they want to hire Americans. They want to bring in, American expertise and goods. And when I got finished, she said, I don't know if we really want to get involved in this because we helped the Brazilians with soybeans a few years ago, and now they're not buying as much from us. And I've said this story many times. My reaction, and these were the exact words I said to her. I said, listen, I hear you. Nobody's out waving the American flag and pushing American exports more than I am. But we as Americans have a choice to make. These countries are going to do these projects with or without us. It's happening. I mean, it's not just in agriculture, it's across the board. So our choice is we can either participate and potentially bring in tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of orders for, in this case, machinery, mills, silos, seeds, consultants, services too. Or we can sit back and we can say, well, we don't want to participate because we're exporting rice over there now, which in terms of rice, I don't think we're actually exporting that much to Africa. I mean, maybe a little bit. And I said, I guarantee you, our competitors or our adversaries are going to do these projects. Countries are doing with or without us. So we participate, we bring in all these orders for these other inputs, or we're going to sit back. They're going to do these projects, and we're going to be shut out completely because these other adversaries and competitors, they're not bringing in American machinery. They're not bringing in American mills and consultants and seeds and whatever the other inputs are for this. And when I got finished, she said, I never really thought about it like that. And that's really what's happening in a lot of, we sometimes tend to think, well, we've got our blinders on. And listen, I'm sure the people that growing some of these things, they're like, well, maybe. But here's the advantage also. By getting more involved in projects like this one I am, these countries, many of them aren't going to get to self-sufficiency. Right. By deepening our ties there, we're going to potentially be able to capture a larger market share of the remainder between what they're able to grow and self-sufficiency, or as they increase their income levels, they're going to be able to buy more. They're also going to be able to buy more expensive things, which maybe, again, I keep using rice, but we can say corn, we can say soy, whatever it is. Maybe ours is a little more expensive than some of our competitors. Well, as their incomes rise, listen, everybody wants a better product. And whether it's agriculture, whether it's consumer goods, whatever, few and far between are there examples that people say, oh, we don't want the American stuff. It's not good quality. They know it's good quality. They can't just always afford it. So if we're helping lift these countries up economically as well, they're going to be able to afford more. So all around, yes, is there listen, that's capitalism also. We can't, some people win, some people lose. But there are ways I think that we can mitigate our losses and our gains as a country, as an economy, are going to far outweigh any losses that we may suffer.
Yeah, I agree. And do you think it's naive of me to think that boots on the ground relationships are valuable to build trust? Or are we now in a time in history where that doesn't matter anymore?
Not at all. Particularly in many of the countries in the developing world, relationships are probably still much more valued even than we do here. Wow. It's still a face-to-face. I mean, yes, everybody accepts the fact that you can't be flying over to Africa every week or vice versa, but there is a great value on personal relationships. I mean, that's just human nature.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I like that answer. And I guess maybe not a problem, but an issue I can think of, especially maybe in our industry, is the push for, which I agree with, made in the USA. Um, Self-sufficiency for the US. You talk about self-sufficiency in other countries, and my first thought was, well, we are not at this moment self-sufficient either. So I love that pride, and I love that made in the US mentality. But what do you say to those who are opposed to the US helping with developing nations, or maybe are kind of stuck too far into that mindset? What do you say to them?
Well, again, besides politics, my background is history. Mm-hmm. And if you look at history, we kind of stayed on our side of the world until a little bit World War I, but World War II. The world is dramatically different now. Yeah. As I said in California, the world has changed. The days of withdrawing to Fortress America, to staying behind the two oceans as effectively George Washington, advised us to do. Well, he didn't live in an era of airplanes, of pandemics going around the world, of all of rockets, missiles. We can't just be isolationist anymore. It just doesn't work in the 21st century. That doesn't mean that we have to necessarily give up all of our advantages. We can use the strengths and the advantage that we have to improve our standing even more in the world. Listen, again, I'm sorry I'm repeating it, but it goes back to what I said before. If you can't feed your children, you don't necessarily care who your president is. And it's very easy to say, okay, well, those problems, that's their problems. Really? With the refugee issues like we have going around the world? Like, well, whether it's coming up from the southern border, whether it's going to Europe or wherever it is. Listen, you hear people in Central America say this many times. Also, you hear in Africa, there are people fleeing these countries that say, we want to stay home. We need to work. We need to eat. We need to support our family. Borders are porous these days. I'm not talking about every country has a right to protect their own borders. I mean, I think everybody on both sides of the political argument agreed that, even in this country. But refugees, I hate to use the word, but it's reality. Terrorists, unrest is not going to stay over there in a world where communication, where transportation, where everything is pretty much at everybody's fingertips. So listen, I guess we're advantages of when we could shrink and just stay over here, and our two oceans still protect us. I mean, one of the reasons the United States has been able to get to the position in the world we have is because we don't have hostile nations on our borders, which many of the other great powers have.
Right.
But that has broken down again in an age of super communication, transportation. It's just not reality.
Yeah. Something you said there really resonated with me, and still continues to make me think. Something that happened to me a couple of years ago, when you said that, when a family is there and is disconnected and their family is hungry, that's the only thing that matters. Uh, in 2022, we were hit here in Southwest Florida with Hurricane Ian, and I got to experience for the first time in my life being completely disconnected from the world. And I still think about it often, because you can really put yourself into another person's after going through something like that. The hurricane came through. We had no communication with the outside world. We couldn't drive down our streets. We couldn't get food. We were lucky to have food stored because we're new Floridians and people told us to do that. Thank goodness. And but there were people on our street that didn't have enough food. And all that mattered was our community, that our neighborhood, 2 houses that way, 2 houses that way, and the houses across the street. That's all that our whole world made up of. And it was such a shock to me, because well, you're in New Jersey, I'm in Florida. I'm talking to people all across North America every single day. And my world in my head is a lot smaller than what it is in reality when you have no communication and nothing. And as time went on and we had no electricity for 12 days, no internet for half a month, no nothing. It's funny how suddenly you really don't care about politics. Like, I have my head in politics every day, and I didn't care. I just wanted to feed my family. And when I heard that help was coming for us on the radio, we had a crank radio because we had no electricity. So we all took turns in the family cranking up the stupid radio. And we replaced that radio for, hopefully there's not a next one, but we have a better radio for the next time that happens. But to hear that help was coming was the most important thing. And who was bringing it didn't matter. It was, we needed that help, right?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
I don't know whether this there's a direct connection here too, but again, going back to the world as a whole has shrunk. My mom, my late mother used to say, she's like, I don't understand, when my parents came here, they learned English, and I said, Mom, you also have to understand something. When your parents came here, they made a complete break. There wasn't long distance calling like there was today. There wasn't getting on a plane going home. When they left Europe, they left.
Yeah.
That was it. And again, if you look at, yes, as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, but the world, there's definitely, as I said before, a shrunken shape to the world today. So all these things are going to tie together. But at the end of the day, like you say, when it comes to the basics, people are going to think home.
Yeah, for sure. Maslow was right, I think. So switching gears a little bit, why does it make sense for private companies to make these steps and investments rather than leaving it just to government? I think there's a lot of people that would just say, "Oh yeah, like government can take care of this," and I can feel that you disagree.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's certainly a major role for government,
Mhm.
but I think many of us as Americans would think the private sector will work better.
Mhm.
There things can move faster. There's an incentive. Listen, just like on, one of the things we're trying to do is put private companies here together with private companies over there to work in partnership, because you don't have a lot of the bureaucracy to deal with. You don't have a lot of the. I mean, listen, I'm certainly not going to name the country, but I'm working on a project right now because listen, we're trying to help. We're trying to help get products into the United States too. Trade's a two-way
Right.
street.
That's
You
right. That's
know,
important to think of.
yeah, we're trying
Mhm.
to be very careful to make sure that things we're bringing in isn't hurting, going to hurt sales here in the United States. But listen, I think like we're not actually working on this, but I'll use this as an example. I think 75% or so of seafood in the United States is imported.
Wow.
I mean, some of these things are just crazy numbers. So we're not producing enough for ourselves in some sectors. But what I'm saying is, to your question, I was introduced to some of the government officials. I did some of my own research. I said, oh yeah, I found some of these companies I think would be really good. We're importing this, or we're importing that. And we'd like to help African companies like here in your country do it. And I spoke with a number of the, let's just say, government officials or employees there, got no response. And listen, I call and call and call and call. I mean, I pride myself on I am a follow up guy. I will, to the point of being annoying. Just have to do that. One of the advantages of being up from this part of the country, we're a little bit more upfront. But I tell you, I went to the private sector folks, and boy, I'm getting answers.
Right.
So, again, we can't do it without the support of government.
Mhm.
But there is just, and I think most Americans would agree in this. There's just a different. There's a different view, and there's a much higher level for success when there's incentive. Again, that's capitalism.
That's it. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And then in your opinion, then what is the ideal role of government in this issue?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things. I mean, one of again, Africa specific right now, there's something called the African Growth and Opportunity Act. I think if I remember correctly, it was first put into place in 2005, and it's renewed every 10 years. It's up again in 2000, well, hopefully be renewed 2025. And what that does, it gives some incentives. Gives some tax breaks to some, for example, things coming in from Africa. Um, I don't know all the things off the top of my head, but unfortunately, it hasn't been taken advantage of enough. It's been taken advantage more with some of the minerals and things like that. But when you're talking like, let's say, fruits and I think the clothing, it's been utilized some pretty good amount. But there's a lot of products they do make there that it gives them a little bit of advantage over stuff coming from other parts of the world. That's clearly a role that government has to do. Listen, we have the United States. We're fortunate again because of our wealth. In most of the embassies around the world, you will find commercial offices from the Commerce Department. There are agricultural officials there. That is just some incredible insight they can give into each of these countries for folks like us who need to, hey, what are some of the regulations here? Who are some of the real business people here that, we don't want to waste our time with people who aren't serious. Who are they? And they can direct us to some of that. So there's a lot of different roles that government can play, setting policies. I mean, listen, I'm not a international law attorney. There's treaties with investment, policies that need to be set by government. There was one thing we were involved in kind of peripherally a number of years ago, had to do with milk powder. And there was a dispute over the paperwork that the country wanted. I guess the world had pretty much changed the paperwork to some other form. We didn't use that form. And they said, well, we want everybody using the same form now. And there was back and forth. And well, they kind of shut down imports for a while until we came to an agreement of, yeah, this is what it's going to say on the forms. That's not something that private folks like us can do. You've got to have involved in that. So listen, it's not a either or. We need to work hand in hand, and there's clear roles for both. What we're trying to do is work from as much as possible from the private sector side to build the private sector side. Government's well aware of what needs to be done. The private sector here doesn't always necessarily have Africa on the radar screen.
Yeah, great points. And then something in your presentation last month that you touched on a bit was China. So how important is it for the U.S. to reduce this dependence on China?
Our dependence or the dependence of Africa?
Our dependence. Well, actually, yeah, that to extend, and yes, from Africa as well. Yeah, I remember you did talk about that too.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't want to go too far into the political opinion, but there's an overlap here. Again, as I always say, every country has a right to compete, including China, but compete fairly.
Right.
That's part of the problem today is there are some players out there like China who are not exactly competing fairly. Again, my opinion, people who think I like what is the term now, the term of the day is called de-risking as opposed to decoupling. Decoupling in the 21st century between economies the size of the United States and China is just not realistic.
Right.
What we need to make sure is that we are self-sufficient where we need to be self-sufficient, and we need to also diversify our supply chains so that we're not dependent. Again, you can look at history, and one of the reasons we won World War II, World War I, we produced most of what we needed. Now, certainly there were shortages at times. There was rationing and stuff for things. There was rubber during World War II and sugar and some of the other things. But I fear that. I fear that. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly a number of flashpoints in the world. Look at what's happening in the South China Sea. Even if you don't have a full-scale war, God forbid, what if there is some blockades? What if there is an interruption with all the trade that comes through there? Do we really want to be just self-sufficient on things coming from China or one area? That's as far as us. As far as Africa, again, Africa and a lot of these countries in the developing world, their primary concern right now is lifting up their people. And you can't blame them for that. They don't necessarily want to get caught up in a Cold War number 2.
Right.
I've said there was a story, I forgot which country it was, but a number of years ago, for example, um, there was a road that was built. And it was supposed to get, I'm not a construction person, supposed to get like 10 inches of material. And the Chinese came in and did it, and they did it for like 1 inch of material, whatever. And they knew it was going to fall apart in like another year or two. But now this is the guy with the political background talking. You're the president of a country. You've got an election coming up. You need to show your people you're doing something. There needs to be a village to that road. Here's your choice. You can either have the Chinese or somebody come in and do it, but let's say China, because that's what's happening in a lot of Africa today. It's going to fall apart, but you're going to be able to show your people, yeah, you're getting something done. Or there is no or, because countries like the United States, we're not there doing these things.
Yeah.
Which would you choose? Something not as good or nothing? And if you extrapolate that across all the things happening there, again, as I kept saying at the conference, they're not waiting for us.
Right. Yeah, that was such a good point.
And strategically, again, from what I read in the papers, I mean, it's what I read in the papers, but I think I try to read a broad spectrum, so I don't think it's misinformation. China is trying to get a military base. And I think they're looking at like 6 to 8 countries in Africa.
Wow.
As I said, that's not to bring cruise ships in. That is so they can have a 2-ocean navy. And if it ever comes to a problem between the United States and Africa, and I'm sorry, not Africa, between the United States and China, they want to be sure that their ships can harass our ships in the Atlantic as well as the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, putting the moral benefits by helping people and strengthening ties, there's a strategic benefit. And then you can also look at all the mineral wealth in Africa. There's a lot of things here. But again, let me just build on that point for a minute. Nobody wants to feel used either. Countries like in Africa, for example, they've had the West coming in, and now China, taking their minerals and taking. Yeah, they get paid some for it, and not all of it goes into the people's pockets, but that's another story. They want some of these other basics. Help us grow more food so we can feed our people. Help us build our infrastructure so we can get our goods around. I mean, there's so many other things. We look at, kind of goes back to what you said about looking local. We're looking, here's our needs, but human nature, it takes two. And we've got to try to address both sides. And Africa, again, in the great struggle that's going on today, Africa, I believe, may not be in my lifetime, but at some point, Africa could be the great balancer of who wins this struggle. There's 54 countries there. There's 1.2 billion people projected to grow to 2.5 billion, 25% of the world population by 2050. Wow. They are, the way they lean, who they line up with is going to matter economically, because their markets are going to be some of the biggest markets in the world. Everybody's going to want to get their goods in there. They have minerals. They have the largest amount of arable land left in the world today. That's going to matter for, with climate change and everything else, a dwindling food supply. And now is the time to cement these relationships. We've got to lead. Our competitors and our adversaries are getting more and more entrenched.
Right.
It's going to be harder for us 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the line to break into that if others are already established in those markets. We can't keep waiting on this.
Yeah, you can't argue that for sure.
And one of the advantages, and that's what I started to say before, I sidetracked myself. One of the advantages we have, and this just frustrates me to no end, over our adversaries is our network of allies. We have people who I mean, again, I'm not just picking on China. You can look at a number of the other powers around the world that we would have issues with. But how many allies does China have? How many real friends do they have? We have friends and allies around the world who respect us, who admire us, and who want to interact with us, particularly in countries developing, like in Africa. I mean, listen, you go around a number of these countries, you see an Avenue Franklin Roosevelt, an Avenue John Kennedy. In Ghana, there's a George, I think it could be their biggest highway, is a George W. Bush highway because of what he did with helping fight AIDS and stuff. There is an admiration for the United States. But the more we just kind of sit on our hands from an economic level, and I'm not talking Europe, I'm not talking, some of the other countries we're involved with around the world, but these countries where many Americans don't even like, where's that? I've never heard of that country. We're just giving up so many opportunities for our future in so many ways. And, as I say, nobody's going to change the world by themselves, but I'm determined to do my part.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how would somebody get started? It's not like you can just hop on a plane to Africa and go, I'm going to go do business. Like what's a starting point?
Oh, it's difficult. And my business partner would back me up on that. This has taken a lot longer to get going than we thought it would. But listen, there are a number of ways, going back to what you said about government role. I mean, there is, you've got USAID, you've got some of the different organizations, entities with the US government to start learning about some of the things going on there. You can contact some of our embassies. And there's also, again, depending how somebody, wants to go about it, some people may want to think more about working for a company that has some overseas operations, because you learn about it that way.
Right.
And you make your own connections there. You're right. It's not something you just say, oh, well, here I am. I want to just go in there. And, again, I keep going back. You said about government. There's actually a service. I forgot what it's called. It's with the United States Commercial Service. And you can do it through most of the embassies. There's a fee. But if you have let's say a product, and you want to see who, I don't know, you can use the old example, widgets. You make widgets, and there's somebody who buys widgets over there, or, you can actually go through this service, and they will do an analysis. Yes, this person is around, stuff like that. Again, there's a fee involved, but there's different ways to do it. And again, with youth, with a lot of the young people getting involved with the USAID or some of the organizations that you can go, Peace Corps or something like that. When you get older and you have to support a family and stuff, you may not be able to necessarily survive on that income. But you build. It's like travel. You build a love of traveling, or things when you're younger, and it lasts a lifetime. Mm-hmm. So you start, you take, I guess in England, they would call it a gap year, or, after you get out of college and something like that. Try to do one of those things. You'd be surprised.
Yeah, good advice. And so if people have more questions for you, where can they find you?
We have, they can email me at Gary Hirsch, GaryHirsch, at Global Opportunities, OPPORTUNITIS, .us. I had to get the US in there.
Mhm.
Um, and we have on, we have a website, it's globalopportunities.net. And they can, communicate with us through that also. Um, and yeah, I mean, I work around the clock pretty much. So I guarantee if somebody sends us something, we're going to answer it. We're going to get back in touch.
Yeah, awesome. So I have one last question for you. Why do you serve in this way? What are you most passionate about this everything that you do?
Well, I guess that I can answer that in a couple ways. I can answer that by saying, listen, morally, again, I really believe in building these relationships.
Mm.
Um, I think it's important. I think it's from a human standpoint. I mean, you're helping people help themselves. But I don't want to get too flag waving here. But listen, this country has been very good to my family. Um, my family, I don't know how you exactly, I don't know how exactly you count it. So I had one grandparent born here, and the other three were born overseas. So does that make me a second or third generation American? I'm
Ooh,
not sure.
right.
Um, but listen, America's been very good to my family. My
Mhm.
family wouldn't be here without the United States. My late father served during World War II. I when I was pretty much as got to the age that I could pretty much understand anything, there was always a passion and a reverence for America and for the United States and what the United States stands for. And I've carried that through life.
I love
Um,
that.
there's everybody's got their causes, and the United States is my cause. I believe in it. I believe in democracy. Listen, I'm the first one to say I'm not one of these people who say we've never made a mistake in our history. We've made mistakes, but we also don't get. I believe the United States does not get credit for all the good things we do. Some of it's because we just don't take the credit for it, but I believe we're the greatest country there is. And I believe that we should utilize our standing to deepen the relationships with folks in countries like Africa. So we will continue to be the shining light that we've been through much of our history.
I love that. Yeah, great answer. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Gary. What a great conversation.
My pleasure. I appreciate the invitation.
And thanks to all who are watching or listening. If you want to learn more, links are provided in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe to North American Egg Spotlight on YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram channels. And the podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Listen Notes, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like the episode, I'd love it if you shared it. And have a great day.